So before I share some communication strategies that you guys can use with gender questioning adolescents, I know it's not the best term, but we'll stick with it for now. First, I have to tell you how I discovered these strategies myself. I've been working with adolescents as a therapist for over 15 years and with gender dysphoria since 2016. And I want to tell you today about my patient zero, who I'll call Rania, but I'll change some details about her, and the truth is that meeting her changed the trajectory of my life and my career. Let me set the stage. Earlier in my career, I had worked with autism, sexual violence and domestic abuse, and intellectual disabilities. When I met Rania, I had taken a job as a counselor in a charter school serving kids and families in a low-income part of Houston, Texas. If you'd like to know what I looked like in 2015, you're in luck, because I'm going to unveil the most exquisite and only portrait that's ever been done of me. That is courtesy of a 6th grader named Jesus. So back to Rania. She was in 7th grade when I met her, and people found Rania a bit awkward. Her moods would change on a dime, her mannerisms were quite weird, and she casually referenced anime characters by first name like they were mutual acquaintances. During lunch, Rania sat alone, but I was intrigued by her. What I saw looking past her smudgy glasses and disheveled hair was a kid who was genuinely sweet, though a little bit lost. I wanted to connect with Rania, and I did. During her 7th grade school year, she frequently ended up in my office, sometimes if she was just happy and wanted to share some good news, but more often because she wanted to vent a frustration or she was sent there by an exasperated teacher. Rania liked our visits. She started bringing me sketches of anime characters and telling me about the progress she was making in her video games. I should mention that around that time, I started our campus's first gay-straight alliance. We had a really traditional, kind of normative student body, and I wanted all of our students, especially same-sex attracted kids, to feel welcomed and accepted. But when we led meetings, I always carefully selected activities that would not reinforce stereotypes or produce gender confusion. During the next school year, Rania's 8th grade, I hadn't seen much of her, and I took it as a good sign. But at some point, she began telling teachers she didn't want them using her name anymore, and that she might not be a girl after all. We talked in my office many times after that, and I came to learn a few things. First off, Rania had spent a lot of time researching gender identity labels online. She came to believe that her disdain for feminine beauty routines and frilly dresses made her not a girl. And she read that using a breast binder is a great way to try on a new identity to see if it's authentic. This was early 2016, and as it happens, I already had my eye on the concept of a trans kid. I knew all about therapists insisting that affirmation of the new identity is a must. I knew all about Tumblr and YouTube influencers with massive followings, and I knew that desperate parents were unable to find help for their kids after a sudden announcement of being trans. So when Rania told me about her foray into trans Reddit and Discord, I felt prepared, but I also knew I had to tread carefully and offer her some guidance. I validated her desire to understand herself better, but I steered her away from dogmatic ideas she found online. After our meetings, I would casually joke, "You know, you can't believe everything you read on the internet." She'd flash her little curious smile and say, "Yeah, I know, Miss Ayad." Over several months, I reinforced that there's nothing wrong with wearing comfy cargo pants. I told her about the health consequences of using a binder and tried to offer her genuine compliments when I could. It's really cool that you love Japanese culture and manga. Yes, you are quite unique compared to other girls at this school, but that doesn't mean you're not a girl, Rania. As her performance in class improved, her visits to my office became less frequent. But before we let out for summer break, I went to check in with her. Rania told me that that thing we used to talk about, meaning gender, was no longer an issue for her. She said that for a while she had been really lonely, and these trans online groups helped her make virtual friends. But now she said she had some friends at school and no longer needed gender identity to connect with others. And I happen to know that even years later, this gender issue has remained a non-issue for Rania. So that was my patient zero, and it was actually pretty straightforward for several reasons. First of all, Rania and I initially developed a rapport completely outside of her gender questioning. Secondly, she thought of me as knowledgeable and trustworthy regarding sexuality and gender stuff, so I already had credibility. And using some basic common sense interventions, I just helped her slow down, planted some seeds of doubt, and encouraged her to keep her focus broad. Then she made some new friends and just moved on from gender. Eventually, I decided to leave the school and make this my full-time focus. So I began reading the clinical literature and even reviewed firsthand accounts of gender dysphoria and transition. But I really wanted to understand the contemporary changes in this population. How does our current culture affect all of this? ROGD had not been named yet by Dr. Littman, but I already knew it was a thing. I had seen it with my own eyes in my GSA meetings with kids talking about pronoun bracelets and novel gender identity labels that they read online. I was reading Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and I studied things like extremist groups, cults, religious conversions, and started to connect with people like Lisa Marciano, Stella O'Malley, and so many others who are here today. When I started my practice in 2016, as far as I could tell, I was the only therapist in the US explicitly and publicly recommending against literal gender affirmation, except for, of course, the much more experienced Dr. Stephen Levine. And as you might guess, I was quickly flooded with hundreds of desperate messages from parents who worried about their children. I began taking on adolescent clients and consulting with these parents, and a fuller picture emerged, one that I could not glean from my work with Rania. I discovered that without the trust, rapport, and perception of my expertise in gender, these kids could be really difficult to get through to. I'd plan for a session, drop a brilliant insight, expecting a light bulb moment, only to have it go terribly, terribly wrong. It seemed like these kids didn't actually want to heal their gender dysphoria at all. If anything, they were protecting their identities with every ounce of adolescent conviction. It was like the prospect of making peace with their natal sexed bodies was a kind of self-betrayal. As of this month, I've worked with over 900 families. About 74% have females and 26% have males. And during my time with all these families and several dozen adolescents in individual therapy, I've come to believe something really important. When we struggle to get through to someone, it's almost always because we don't actually understand their experience. In fact, in therapy, I believe we have to try and go beyond an intellectual understanding and almost intimately and viscerally feel what our clients are experiencing, while of course being able to pull out to get the bird's eye view. Now look, some kids are quite open-minded and flexible, and they genuinely want to have thought-provoking conversations about their identity. And in those cases, developing a deep, intimate understanding is wonderful, but it's not a requirement to have the conversation. However, if a young person completely blows up at you for suggesting they take their time or get a little older before making permanent medical decisions, you need to understand what is going on for them. Now, part of it, of course, is that they're teenagers and that many of us at that age were filled with urgency and conviction. But the beliefs about gender and identity circulating in our culture today add a layer of complexity to this normal teenage angst. Reddit threads and Discord servers and LGBT school clubs and counselors and best friends can all nudge a teen to believe that her happiness lies just on the other side of a new name, new pronouns, and medical intervention. A teen might come to think, if only I could be seen as my authentic gender, then my life would finally begin. And in an act of self-preservation, I'm begging you, no, I'm demanding that my life needs to start now. No more waiting, no more suffering, no more suppressing my own needs. And anyone standing in my way is either uninformed, bigoted, or doesn't care about me being happy. How do we contend with that? Now, I'm not saying that formulation is accurate. Actually, during my entire career in the gender world, I've been pointing out all the ways that that formulation is not accurate. But that formulation is powerful, and it's emotionally salient. And we humans are built for narrative and fantasy and hope. And the hope of constructing the right body is super enticing to many adolescents. And what about these metaphors? Being born in the wrong body and a girl brain and a boy body. Metaphors convey a feeling, but it can apply to so many adolescent experiences. A 13-year-old girl going through puberty feels alienated from her body. It doesn't feel right to her. A boy who makes a social mistake and gets harshly thrown out of his only friend group, he's overcome with shame and self-loathing, and he wishes he was someone else in that moment. Or a masculine tomboy is criticized and questioned for her looks and her attraction to girls. Or even a teenage boy who discovers that it excites him to imagine his body becoming more feminized, and he's deeply distressed by his male anatomy. They all could feel like they're in the wrong body. These body mismatch metaphors now operate beyond the figurative realm. Rather than trying to bridge a gap or just explain a visceral experience, they're being interpreted as a literal thing. And many young people want to physically embody the metaphor of gender and have it validated and confirmed by everyone else. I would argue that we should take the distress seriously, but not literally. So now that we understand the experience of many gender-questioning adolescents, let's talk about communication strategy. We'll look at 11 broad principles that can guide your conversations, and I'll even offer some sample language, though keep in mind there are many ways you could express these principles as long as they are true for the child you're talking to. And younger teens, of course, need more structure and direct guidance, where older adolescents need mentorship and not micromanagement. Focus on the relationship. This is actually the only leverage you have to help someone think more flexibly, especially if they're hesitant to open up or worried that you could undermine their experience. Find ways to enjoy low-pressure, easy, positive moments together, like Sue asking about the anime characters. Rebuilding trust may have to come ahead of gender conversations, so don't rush this process. But at some point, when you need to talk about more serious matters, stay focused on the way you want to relate with the other person. For example, if there's been a serious conflict or damage in the relationship because of a previous discussion, consider having a reset conversation. I call this a reset because it's designed to acknowledge the current dynamics and chart a new, different way forward. You apologize for how you might have communicated in the past and take ownership for things that you regret. So again, this is the how of communication, how you've discussed the issue, how you responded before, how you relate, even if there's conflict. Now, notice I'm not asking you to capitulate to a list of demands or lie or say something that's not true. But if you lost your temper, or if your emotions took over during a previous conversation, you take ownership of that. Apologize for how you communicated, but don't apologize for having told the truth. I've been thinking about the last few times we talked about your identity. I know my reaction wasn't great, and I probably spoke to you in a way that was very hurtful. That didn't make you feel like you want to talk to me about this topic, and I'm sorry for how I reacted. I care about our relationship and don't want anything to get in the way of our connection. Can we try again? I promise to be more thoughtful about how I engage in these conversations. And if the person is willing to talk, try to understand their perspective, but keep reading between the lines. We're going to come back to this shortly. Find areas of agreement. Finding points of agreement helps you express benevolence and build credibility, and this too has to be genuine. So really think about it and come up with a few examples. Here's how I would express agreement with a lot of gender-questioning young people. Something I really like about your perspective on gender is that the sex you're born with should not determine what kinds of hobbies, clothes, preferences, or hairstyles we have. Use heartfelt honesty. Being truthful and honest doesn't have to be harsh. Yes, I know that facts don't care about your feelings, but if we actually want to get through with a defensive adolescent, we'd better deliver the truth with warmth and care. So for example, if your daughter is demanding that you see her as a boy and pressuring you to use different pronouns, you can try something like this. Honey, I can see how important your gender identity is to you. You've probably noticed I've been trying and fumbling a lot with your new pronouns. I really need to be honest with you because I don't believe in lying to my kids, and I love you. I know that you're my daughter, and I don't see you as a boy. Regardless of how you dress or even what medicines you may take when you're older, I can't just make my brain forget who and what you are. Of course, I want to help you feel better and be respectful of your exploration, but I can't continue to be inauthentic with you. Acknowledge the positive impulse. People seek social or medical transition for important reasons. The drivers behind their desires are valid, even if the conclusions they've drawn may be flawed. I can see how much you've been struggling with your body, and I know you wouldn't be thinking about medical transition unless you truly believed it would help you feel better. There's nothing wrong with seeking out ways to feel better, and I also want you to feel better in your body. I'm just not sure that these medications or surgeries are going to give you what you're hoping for. Speak to their highest values. Sometimes gender-questioning adolescents behave in ways that are uncharacteristic for them. Parents love to tell me that their son won't even take an Advil, but now he wants to take testosterone blockers and estrogen for the rest of his life. Much of this contradictory behavior can be explained by bizarre lies circulating about identity, dysphoria, and medicine. For example, some call cross-sex hormones correct sex hormones and claim that taking them will restore some supposed natural health to your endocrine system and heal your dysphoria. In light of this, you have to try and nudge a person towards the values that already make up a fundamental part of who their character is. This might help them be a bit more cautious. I've always loved how analytical your mind is. You question and examine things that others take at face value. Even as a kid, you like to find out for yourself the pros and cons of different options. So when it comes to ideas about gender and medical transition, I imagine you'll look for all kinds of ideas, even the stuff that's harder to find or challenging to consider. Engage their critical thinking skills. The world of gender identity dogmatism is full of thought-stopping slogans and cliches, basically the opposite of critical thinking. So you can start outside of gender. One parent I worked with taught her daughter logical fallacies and gave her $5 every time she could spot one in a TV show, movie, or social media. The Blocked and Reported podcast is frequently cited by kids I've worked with as a sort of gateway drug to deeper reflection about cultural issues. And by the way, I have to say, this has to be at least in part of how Katie and Jesse use humor on the show. It's hard to be angry and dogmatic while you're laughing. The point is that critical thinking in other areas can generalize and help a young person gain clarity about their own experience with identity. So you could ask, what are some of the strangest trends you've seen on social media, either positive or negative? Why do you think so many of us get sucked into unhealthy online behaviors? And when have you been noticeably impacted by stuff you've seen on social media? Introduce dissonance gradually. Helping a young person to consider nuance or complexity in any situation requires patience. This is a marathon and not a sprint. Sometimes I call it planting seeds of doubt. And in general, with all the communication strategies we're talking about today, the idea is not to get immediate 100% buy-in or agreement. The mission is just to get the wheels turning, provide some new ideas, and expose contradictions gently. I get the gender expression stuff, expanding beyond stereotypes and norms. I guess what I don't understand is why people are changing their identity labels to express themselves with more freedom. That seems like a new way of getting trapped in new labels, right? Or is it helpful to build an identity that puts you in conflict with your physical body? Avoid fear tactics and terrorism. Don't shoot me for saying this. This is what Sue said when she got to controversial areas. Don't shoot me. Okay, so personally, I think it's unethical when gender-affirming professionals use the threat of suicide to pressure parents into affirmation. I also think it can be counterproductive and maybe even a little cruel to use the threat of a ruined life or a destroyed body to dissuade young adults from transitioning. Look, I know that these drugs and surgeries literally can damage the body. And I also know that the suicide threat is not only morally questionable, it's actually factually incorrect. But remember that catastrophizing compromises credibility. Here's why. None of us actually know the future. Even people who end up regretting their transition often have a period of months or even years when things seem to be going great. Researchers even call this the honeymoon period. So imagine a 22-year-old telling her friend after taking testosterone, "My dad said that taking testosterone would ruin my life, but I'm 3 months in and I feel amazing. I can't take anything he says about gender seriously." So you see what a trap that can be. Instead, a tentative approach maintains your credibility and makes it more likely that you can actually get through with some much-needed information. It would be wonderful if social and medical transition always led to long-term health and happiness, but unfortunately, it seems like that's not always the case. There are future medical trade-offs that you might think you're fine with now, but nobody can understand what it means to have chronic health problems later this early in the process. I'd like to show you some medical information about this. Make tentative observations. Remember when I told you to have a reset conversation, listen more closely, and read between the lines? Well, a couple things you could be listening for are, what is the person trying to gain through their identity? And what are they trying to avoid? Gently describe what you notice. So here's what a parent could say to their daughter Jessica, for example, who threw away her wardrobe last summer and took on a new identity as a trans boy. I was thinking about everything you went through last year with your old friend group and how you started exploring a different online identity after that. I could be wrong, but it seems to me that you're trying to get rid of who you were before as Jessica. After all, it was Jessica who got bullied and Jessica who suffered. I think that part of you, as Jessica, deserves care, compassion, and healing, not to be thrown away and discarded like this. Encourage acceptance. Adolescence, as we've heard all morning, is a time of being thrust out of childhood into new freedoms and responsibilities. Adults have to accept difficult things that are part of life. And something adolescents, and frankly many adults, have a really hard time accepting is being misunderstood. But in fact, being misunderstood is inevitable, and coming to grips with this is a common theme that I see in therapy. There is no curated aesthetic or carefully selected identity label that guarantees people will get you. Some people will look at you and make snap judgments and get a lot of things wrong, whether you transition or not. And yes, some judgments may come from cruelty, but many more come from ignorance. And you know what? That's okay. It doesn't mean that you or the other person have failed or done something wrong, because being intimately known by another person and deeply known is a process that takes time, vulnerability, and relationship. There's no shortcut through gender labels or pronouns or cosmetic changes. And build a positive vision. As we've discussed, the desire for self-transformation is often built on a fantasy and a hope for a better future. So in addition to helping someone understand the limits of reality and the trade-offs inherent to medical transition, we also have to offer a positive vision regardless of gender. A good life is built outside of identity labels. So what would it look like if you didn't care so much what others think, and if you felt good about yourself? What would it look like to be confident? Regardless of what happens with your gender identity, you can start to build confidence right now, though it does involve some challenges. You have to take some personal risks and do things that fall outside of your comfort zone. Building confidence also requires you to get out of your head and into your body, develop your passions, and pursue your interests. It involves making friends and learning how to be a good friend. You're more than just a walking gender identity. So let's look at the bigger picture together. Thank you. So two questions. Make them good ones, says Jennifer. I can't make them good ones. That is a limit of my reality. I can't make them good ones.
Hi, I'm Sue. I'm a parent of a classic RAGD girl who has now desisted. But I had a question with regards to what's psychological drivers behind, we often hear about the child being good, easy, compliant. What's going on with that? And secondly, what's the link between anime and trans?
Okay, yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I want to be fair to the more volatile kids, because I do think there's almost two buckets. There's maybe more, but there are the hyper-compliant kids, and then there are the kids who have a history of being quite challenging to parents. So there are both. I don't want to paint a picture that's too broad. I think what's going on with those kids is they tend to be quite people-pleasing, and they tend to be quite timid, and as we heard all morning, they tend to lack a lot of self-assuredness. And that shows up as being, very not confident in themselves, lacking a sense of self. And so I think sometimes gender identity comes in almost handed to them on a platter of like, here's a way you could demand a lot from everybody, and they have to do it or they're bad people. And it's bizarre to live in a time and a culture where all of society is also colluding with that kind of power fantasy. So I think it comes in and serves as a way for kids to try to take that power back. And sometimes I say that gender identity can serve as a temporary life raft. I think someone alluded to this yesterday in different language. But I think at times, if it's held lightly, kids can use this metaphor of gender to get some of these needs met, and hopefully they can learn that it wasn't really the identity itself that was allowing me to do this, it was me. I started asking people for something. I started taking the risk of asserting myself, and then hopefully they can carry that skill onto them even when the gender identity is no longer serving. So with your daughter desisting, I presume that she's moved on from it, so that's great. And I mean, the thing about anime is really interesting. I think, I want to be mindful not to get too drilled down into labels, but I do think kids who have neurodivergence tend to be really attracted to these cartoons. One theory I heard, it's not mine, but it really resonated, was that kids who have a hard time reading emotional cues in others really like the clarity that anime can provide. Like the smiles are ginormous, the frowns are very obvious, and I happen to talk like that, so I think maybe that's why I worked with autistic kids for so long. Very expressive. I recently did a little bit of research into this. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of anime characters that have gender-bending themes in the stories. So I think that crossover can happen very naturally. And as far as I know, nobody's really studying it academically, but those are just some theories about anime that I've heard. So, other questions? Last one. Make it a good one, Maya.
Okay, so what I really liked about your presentation was honestly all of it. It was fantastic. But out of all the episodes of Wider Lens that I've listened to and synthesized, what I've gathered is really that regret or lack thereof is like a really bad measure for treatment outcome, because the harm exists regardless of whether or not somebody assimilates that experience as regret. And I promise this is going to be relevant. Okay. I wonder, why do you think it is that there are some people for whom, whether in the short term or in the long term, they seem to thrive maybe despite a transgender identity? And I say despite because there's no evidence that the identity itself can be like attributed to positive outcomes. So why do you think it is that there are some people who seem to thrive maybe despite a transgender identity, and others for whom the sort of crumbling and self-destruction is nearly immediate?
Wow, that's such a good question. That was a good one.
I told you so.
Whoever picked mine. Okay. Okay. There are a couple things that come to my mind, and I want to start broad, and then maybe I'll get more specific. The truth is that human beings are bizarre. We don't know. We don't know why things work and why things don't work. And again, this is like the limits of psychotherapy. We can't have complete certainty about anything. So I could stand up here and like philosophize about it, but we don't know. Look at all the different ways across the globe that human beings can live their lives. We're flexible and adaptable. And so I would never stand up here and say that transition is guaranteed to be something that implodes or destructs. I think we can all agree that the medical scandal aspect of this involves no informed consent, no basis for intervention, and very poor outcomes, right? That's what we're all here to talk about. But in terms of, on an individual level, what kind of maybe odd things people may do to their bodies that make them feel better, I don't know why that is the case. One thing that I suspect, though, is because a lot of people today are transitioning with the false belief of a fantasy. When reality hits them, you talked about this, Jaco, reality, you bump up against it eventually. And I think that is why you see people absolutely just become completely destroyed. And I've been kind of thinking about the concept of an acceptance-based personal identity versus a denial-based personal identity. So I think when people go into medical transition in denial about the limits of medicine, that it's, there are trade-offs involved. You can alter yourself cosmetically, but you're not literally transforming into another sex. Not understanding those limits of reality, I think, is what creates such distress in people. And then others, perhaps, that have maybe a more sober, grounded understanding of what these medicines can and can't do, and perhaps they say, I'm willing to make that health trade-off, for example. They may persist in their trans identity and never experience this kind of crisis of meaning. But I think when you go into any medical procedure or treatment under a false illusion of what you are and are not getting, you're bound to destroy crush their soul, really. Yeah. Thank you.